The events took place in a bright room. The girl was drawing on a photo, and when she was asked if she was ready to tell everything, she froze. It was a hospital, and a doctor was standing next to the patient and asking what kind of place it was. Suddenly, the girl looked up and looked at the doctor. He handed her a piece of paper and said that she could write everything on it if it was more convenient for her. The patient looked down, and then she took the paper, saying that she would write about everything better. She started by writing class 1 to 9 inches. The events moved back to the beginning of this eerie, mysterious story. The bus was speeding along with the number 1 to 9 inches written on it. In the back seat, Sharon Jong tried to take her phone from a classmate. It had a photo of her where she didn't look very good. That was Yunsan Lee. He always did all sorts of stupid things that didn't always have good consequences. Other classmates sat in silence, each going about their business. A sad young man sat next to Yunsan Lee. It was Ji-hoon An, who pretended as much as possible that he was not interested in all this. Nothing interesting happened in the front seats at all. A girl with dark short hair was sitting on the side. Next to her, someone was typing loudly and quickly on her phone. A neighbor shouted out her delight that her friend had followed him on Twitter. Se-yeon asked her neighbor Yura to stop voicing her thoughts so loudly. She shouted out aloud, "Gigomen," which means sorry in Japanese, and then apologized normally and smiled wryly. After that, Yura Choi made a face and called her neighbor a ragged beggar. Se-young heard her classmate muttering and asked her again, but she quickly took it back as if she hadn't said anything. Suddenly, someone tapped her shoulder with a finger. It was a classmate with long brown hair, and he offered to switch places. Mung Jin-woo said he was starting to feel sick in the back seat. Yura Choi seemed to blush and become embarrassed and nervously agreed, thinking that she was not ready for such intimacy. And she quickly ran away from her seat in shame, looking at her phone. She tweeted that there was a girl in her class who was on Social Security, and she was very insecure and had just spoken nonsense, showing her complex, and her crush got involved and switched places, and she was very touched by it. She also wrote that Man Jin-woo looked at her very hotly. Yura Choi came to a girl with glasses who was reading a book. It was Cho In-hyun, the head of their class. Yura thought that her neighbor was a nerd, that she even studied all the way, showing everyone her intelligence. When Choi sat down, someone sharply hit her in the seat. She turned and wanted to start swearing, but stopped abruptly. After all, she was sitting in front of Ye-jong Lee, who asked her in a gentle voice if she would mind if they moved her seat a little bit, because it was cramped. Then she smiled sweetly, but everyone realized that it was not sincere. Yura Choi was nervous and said in an uncertain voice that there was no problem, and she liked it even better. And when Ye-jong Lee looked away, Yura's expression changed dramatically. The headman, Jae In-hyun, looked up from his reading, but she kept quiet and continued to study. The girls started laughing at Yura Choi for saying that she liked it better and that she would tweet about Ye-jong Lee, but she denied it, saying that Yura would not do that to a friend. A girl was sitting next to me who seemed to be indifferent to everything, but was watching the situation closely. It was Ji and Kim, who turned away from everyone and looked out the window, calling her classmates idiots. Ji-hoon An behaved the same way. The events moved to the front seats again. Myung-jun-woo and Se-young-han sat silently and looked at the floor. Then she decided to speak up and ask her neighbor why he was following her all the time. But he decided to turn the conversation to her, saying that Se-young was daydreaming and he was just sick to his stomach. She exhaled, said she didn't care, and asked me not to bother. Meanwhile, in front of her, someone was twitching their leg very loudly. The class was driven by a bus driver. Suddenly, he turned and shouted at the boy to stop jerking his leg. He abruptly grabbed his leg, trying to stop her. Next to him sat an old bald man who was watching his neighbor's reaction closely. Henson had a healthy blue spot on his neck that looked like a bruise. The teenager himself was very nervous and looked bad. The old man seemed to notice this as well and asked Hanson if he was still having problems with his friends. Henson Kim kept asking again and again, and then he said that it happened, but then quickly denied it. Chunbae Park put his hand on the teenager's arm. He was a classroom teacher, and said that to him it looked like Hanson was making a fool of himself to be bullied. The teenager was silent, then Chunbae Park said he was sorry. Also in the back seat was Sinja Kang, a boy with blonde long hair. It was his face that stuck with me so much, that strange expression on his face, in the memory of the patient, who was Se-young-han. She was painstakingly writing something in terrible handwriting, and got scared when the doctor asked if he could ask her something. He held the photo in his hands and wondered why they were all wearing sportswear. The girl did not look up and said that it was for outdoor activities near the water. The doctor asked about water. Se-young said they were at sea, to be precise. Suddenly, the patient looked up, looked at the doctor, and asked where everyone else was. There was a pause. The doctor was silent, as if he did not know how to present the information correctly. In that photo, everyone had a painted expression on their face except for Se-yeon. The photo was taken upon arrival on the count of 3. After the photo, everyone was outraged that they were forced to wear tracksuits on a school trip. At this point, the teenagers were told to hand over all their phones. Chief Jae-in held the sack and said she was sorry, but Mr. Park ordered them to pack it because they were going to travel by sea. Sua-an and Sharon-chan resented having to do this, especially after the sports uniforms they were forced to wear. Suddenly, someone very small was approaching Jae-in with a quick step. It was Se-yeon, and she said that the headman could resolve this issue with Mr. Park on their behalf. But Jae-in could only say a brief apology. After Se-yeon didn't get what she wanted, she abruptly turned around and left. The Starosta's partner told her in her ear not to listen to her because everyone knew that Se-yeon was an idiot. Jae-in didn't say anything in response, just gave Se-yeon a look. Meanwhile, Mr. Park spoke with the instructor and was told that the weather was good and they could safely go out into the water. The teacher said there was nothing to worry about because their school had been practicing this for a long time. So the teenagers put on life jackets and got into the boat, and Mr. Park managed to fall asleep during this time. Myung-woo called Se-yeon, asking if she was nervous and adding that it would be fun. His classmate didn't even look at him in response, just asked if he was 11. She hid her reddened cheeks, as it seemed that Se-yeon was seeing the sea for the first time. At this point, the teenagers asked Mr. Park what they would do next, and noticed that the teacher had fallen asleep. Meanwhile, a strong wind kicked up, so strong that he took off the instructor's cap, and she landed right in the water, close to the boat. The instructor grabbed his face and was outraged that this had happened to him. He turned to the teenagers and told them to wait for him and that he would be back soon. Then he ducked into the water and swam toward the cap. The instructor did not turn off the boat, and the sounds of the engine could be heard. The teenagers sat in silence and did not know what to do. Suddenly, Yun-san Lee laughed, saying that it seemed to him that the motor was still running. He asked if he could try it, saying it looked like a motorcycle. The headman, Jae-in, tried to say that she didn't think it was a good idea, but she was interrupted and told to relax, because Mr. Park would not see her anyway. Yun-san was told that he didn't have the balls to do it, and this motivated the teenager even more. He jumped out of his seat. Then he abruptly plopped down behind the wheel of the boat. Yun-san Lee immediately tried to turn the handle. It made even more roaring engine sounds. Suddenly, the teenager abruptly moved away without even having time to react. Other teenagers followed him, and they were all blown away in a second. His classmates had to hold on very tightly because Yun-san was running at breakneck speed. Se-yeon was small and could barely hold herself in place to avoid being thrown into the water. At this point, Mr. Park began to wake up from the speed. He was shocked when he saw what had happened. Everyone was shouting at Yong-san Lee to slow down because the situation was out of control. Meanwhile, the instructor took out his cap. He put it on and looked around. But I discovered that the boat and the teenagers were nowhere to be found, as if they had fallen underground. Yun-san Lee was pushing buttons on the boat's steering wheel while his classmates cursed him. He said he could not stop it in any way. At that moment, something started dripping on him. It looked like rain. He looked up and saw a black sky and heard thunder. It looks like the instructor lied and the weather was not good for swimming after all. The waves of the sea were hitting the boat as the wind was getting stronger. Se-yeon was scared. She had never seen the sea, let alone such strong waves. At that moment, a huge wave covered them all. Everything happened so abruptly, and now the boat with the boat was underwater. Jae-in barely held on to her seat, but dropped all her phones. Se-yeon noticed this and called the headman, but she could not resist and simply went underwater, leaving her life jacket behind. And so, Jae-in drowned underwater along with the phones. Se-yeon looked at what had happened to the headman. Manjun-woo was also watching and called Se-yeon over. She was silent and did not answer, and then it abruptly turned over and ducked under the water. Manjun-woo screamed even louder, because he seemed to be genuinely worried about his classmate. But it was too late. Se-yeon went underwater with Jae-in, and the boat was overturned by a strong wave. After what seemed like a long time, Manjun-woo opened his eyes. The first thing he did was to call Se-yeon, but when he realized that he was not on the water, he abruptly stood up. He looked around, looking for Se-yeon. The teenager saw two girls come out of the sea. That was Se-yeon, who was carrying Chaeyeon, which was very difficult for her. They both fell to the shore as soon as they got out of the water. Manjun-woo quickly ran after them to help his friends. The teenagers found themselves on a large island surrounded by water on all sides. When Jae-in fell underwater, she immediately began to drown. At first, she was conscious, but she could not do anything, so she slowly went underwater. Then she lost consciousness, and there was no hope for salvation. Suddenly, someone grabbed her by the jacket of her suit. Jae-in opened her eyes sharply. In front of her was her classmate Se-yeon, who rushed to save her. She was shocked when she saw a small but very brave Se-yeon in front of her. The events moved to the shore. Jae-in regained consciousness and opened her eyes. Mung Jun-woo noticed this and immediately rushed over to his classmate. He asked her how she was feeling. Jae-in adjusted her glasses, saying that she was fine. She asked how her rescuer Se-yeon felt. Manjun was in no hurry to tell her because she needed to see it. The teenagers fell silent for a while and just watched their classmate. Mung Jun-woo said that she had been doing this for some time, even though they told Se-yeon to stop. The girl was performing heart massage on her classmate, who could not regain consciousness. Surprisingly, Se-yeon knew how to do it correctly and pressed with all her might on the chest. Mung Jun-woo approached her cautiously. He asked her to stop, adding that she had done everything she could. But Se-yeon didn't listen, so Meng Jun called her by name again. The girl continued to press, but weaker each time. Then she looked up, tears streaming from her eyes, and Se-yeon said that she had to save Dansa. My classmate was lying on the sand and looked really bad. At that moment, Jae-in came over and was frightened when she saw her friend. The poor girl just threw up on the sand from what she saw. Myung-woo said in a calm voice that Se-yeon herself realized that Dansa could not be saved. She exhaled loudly and sadly, saying that she understood everything and promised to stop. After that, the teenagers took their life jackets, and then they covered Dansa with them and stood there in silence, in a deathly silence. Jae-in was shaking and could not believe what had happened. Silent tears flowed from the girl's eyes. Especially the starosta was given away by her hand, which was trembling so much that you could even hear it. Se-yeon noticed this and said that the others didn't know anything, so she suggested keeping it between them. Jae-in promised to talk about it when they all got together. The company returned to the rest of the classmates, and they immediately noticed that Dans was missing and pounced with questions about him. They had to tell them everything, and after hearing everything, Yejong Lee just snorted and then asked for her phone back, as if nothing had happened. Jae-in was clearly not expecting such a request after everything that had happened, so she asked again. Then Sua-an and Cherin-chan joined in, demanding their mobile devices back. They added that they had inspected the area, and there was nothing but grass and trees. Jae-in said she actually lost all her phones at sea. She recalled how she almost drowned, and the last thing she was thinking about then was phones. My classmates started screaming and getting outraged, thinking it was a cruel joke. Jae-in apologized, stumbling over her words. She still couldn't get over the news about Dansa. Then the rest of the classmates joined in and the indignation grew even more. Jae-in slipped into her tracksuit and silently listened to the teenagers' indignation. She was nervously rummaging through her costume and couldn't even hear what they were talking about. Chae Jin-jong said she knew Jae-in couldn't be trusted with a phone, adding that hers was brand new. Suddenly, someone sharply pushed her away. Firewood fell on the floor with a comment that it would soon be dark. And the nights were cold and all their clothes were wet, so there was no time for quarrels, unless one wanted to die of cold. Se-yeon said that. And she added that if they were all so eager to find the guilty party, they would have been better off turning to the one who was really guilty. She went on to say that the person who asked Jae-in to collect the phones was Mr. Park. And then she asked who, like an idiot, had jumped into the driver's seat in the boat, hinting at Yunsan Lee. Se-yeon started to say that he was the reason for Don-soo, but she stopped talking, gritting her teeth. And then she exhaled loudly and asked which of them had the lighter. Everyone was silent. Then Se-yeon held out her hand and told them to move faster, because she knew they were all smoking. The teenagers were sneakily silent, and Mr. Park looked around to see the smoker. Se-yeon was still holding her hand, waiting for the lighter. Suddenly, someone gave himself away and put it on the girl's hand. It was Ji-hoon-an, and he didn't even look Se-yeon in the eye. Ji and Kim remained silent as she watched Ji-hoon. Se-yeon grabbed the lighter, commenting that Ji-hoon-an wasn't even ashamed. The teenager silently turned around and went to the others. Mung Jun-woo twirled his finger near his head as if he was daring to do something. Then Mr. Park coughed, making himself known. And then he reassured everyone, saying that the situation was bad, but they didn't have to worry because he had his cell phone with him. Then he ordered them to check their briefcases and lay out everything they were going to eat and drink. Mr. Park came over to the things and asked why they had taken so much water, while others were indignant that they would be sleeping on the ground. And someone said that he was starting to like it, because it was like a hike. Jae-in sat behind everyone else and listened to the conversations. Mung Jun-woo noticed her and asked if she was okay. Jae-in thanked him for his concern, not expecting the attention. And then she asked where Se-yeon was, to which Mung Jun said that she slept like a baby. Then he added that she had to go through a lot to save everyone. Mung Jun kept his eyes on Se-yeon and said that she was too persistent for such growth. Jae-in watched in silence as Mung Jun spoke. The teenager noticed the Starosta's eyes on him and asked what happened. She adjusted her glasses and said that she thought he was in love with Se-yeon. Myung-jun exploded, started screaming and asking how Chae-in found out about it because he hadn't told anyone. After that, he ordered Chae-in not to tell anyone, and the headman pretended that she didn't care. The teenager coughed to cover his face and avoid showing shame. And then he said that Se-yeon looked like a porcupine, but inside she was actually very kind. Chae-in also looked at her classmate and said that Myung-jun was right, and Se-yeon was really a good person. The Starosta's hand was exposed, and there were severe cuts on the wrist, and she offered to talk to Mr. Park. Meanwhile, it was getting dark and everyone was going to bed. But for some reason, some teenagers could not sleep, and were quietly going somewhere with full bags of food and water. They stood over Ji-hoon An, who was sleeping soundly, and tried to wake him up, saying that everyone was waiting for him. He barely opened his eyes, and he saw Yoon-san Lee and the girls above him, who told him to hurry up and be quiet. So they all went through the bushes to another place. Ji-hoon An only had time to wake up and realize what was happening. They came to another campfire, where the rest of their classmates were waiting for them. Shin Jae-kang held out a glass of drink, telling Ji-hoon that he was late, so he had to drink a penalty drink. Meanwhile, the photo showed Don-su's face painted over. The events moved back in time to a narrow street where a little boy was sitting and coughing. Se-yeon stood there, and an old man with a heavy, large wagon was approaching her. He had a medal on his cap. Se-yeon was unpleasantly shocked when she saw her grandfather and asked him to stop collecting waste paper. He was doing it to earn some money. She came closer to him and said that he was not feeling well. The old man smiled and reached into his pocket. Then he smiled even bigger and held out the package. Se-yeon was in no hurry to take it, but first asked what it was. The grandfather shoved it into Se-yeon's pocket, commenting that she was going on a school trip and would need money there. The girl immediately gave the money back, saying that she would not go because she really did not want to. Se-yeon looked down to hide her deception, saying she was sure it would be very boring. And then she added that Eun-jung wasn't getting any better, so she didn't think it was a good idea. Then Grandpa grabbed Se-yeon's hand with both hands, and he said that she really had to go and have fun with her friends, because when she got older, she would not be able to go on a school trip. Se-yeon looked at the money in silence. It was her opportunity to see the sea. Then in an uncertain voice, she agreed and thanked her grandfather. The events moved to the island. Someone was lying on the shore. It was Se-yeon sleeping soundly. Jae-in ran up to her repeating the girl's name. Then she started waking Se-yeon up. It seemed that something really important had happened. She eventually woke up, rubbed her eyes, and asked what happened. Meanwhile, something really happened behind the bushes. Food and drink packages were lying on the ground, and also teenagers who seemed to be dying and felt terrible. Yoon-san Lee laughed at everyone, but Sua-an seemed to be completely sick, vomiting. He told Ye-jong Lee that she looked terrible, and she started beating him up for it. Sua-an complained that she had eaten something wrong, and her friend was afraid she would die of a headache. Se-yeon saw this picture. The girl could not find words to describe her shock. While she was searching for words, the others continued to act like idiots, not even noticing Se-yeon. But her patience seemed to be about to run out. And so it was. Se-yeon shouted loudly that they were all just a bunch of stupid, useless bastards. Ye-jong Lee and Yoon-san Lee interrupted their fight, shocked that they had just been yelled at. At that moment, Mr. Park came over and asked what was going on. Suddenly, an empty tin can of a drink was sharply stepped on. Se-yeon asked what they all thought, if it was just a joke to them. She kept screaming at them for daring to eat and drink all the food they had left. Yoon-san Lee told Se-yeon to watch his tongue. He said that even Mr. Park hadn't said anything to them about it, and asked who Se-yeon thought she was. And then he came closer to his classmate and added that actually, the teacher said he would call for help, so they would get out of here. So he told Se-yeon to shut up if she didn't know anything. Then Mr. Park began to speak timidly. He tried to say that his phone was broken, Then Yun-san Lee started shouting that he promised to save them. Mr. Park did not even dare to look up, saying that he was telling them this to calm them down, because the teenagers were very nervous at the time. Yun-san Lee said he couldn't believe it, and others also started to panic and ask what they should do now. Suddenly, Se-yeon heard a rustling behind her. She turned sharply to see what was there, but I saw nothing. Se-yeon said she thought she saw something there. Yun-sang said he felt sick even when he thought about it. Then he opened the bottle easily, as if he were at a resort, and he just drank it all greedily. Suddenly, a bottle was snatched from his hands. He didn't even notice or realize what had happened. Then he got very angry and asked in an angry voice if he was being bullied. It turned out that it was Myung-jun Woo. He said that Yun-san had heard Se-yeon and they had to save what supplies they had left. Yun-san grabbed Myung-jun by the collar, shouting that they had already gotten him. Se-yeon said in a calm tone that she couldn't believe they were so immature and irresponsible. Then she just took all the water and wagged it, straight to Yun-san Lee. Now he was not so cool. This infuriated the teenager even more, and he threatened to kill Se-yeon. But she wasn't afraid of this idiot at all. She just said that it was their last drinking water. Then she threw the bottle on the ground and added that from now on, they had to find their own food and water to survive. So she suggested that they continue to spend time and energy if they wanted to starve to death. Meanwhile, all the classmates gathered. Shin Jae-kung asked what was going on. Ji-hoon An remained indifferently silent. Se-yeon said that if they wanted to get out of this place alive, and then she pointed at Jae-in, who was quietly watching from behind the bushes. After that, Se-yeon said that they all had to obey the headman. She would be the leader. Chae-in was not prepared for this. Moreover, the starosta himself would not mind obeying someone else. Se-yeon said that Chae-in was now in charge. The starosta asked why it was her. The others were also outraged, saying that Se-yeon had gone mad. Jae-in looked down, not pleased to hear such things. And then I got angry and pulled myself together. Then she ordered them in a stern voice to divide into teams in pairs to search for food. Sua-an was outraged, asking what they were looking for. Jae-in ordered them to gather everything they thought they needed for their survival. Chae-jong opened her mouth and began to say that Jae-in could not have told them what to do. But she was interrupted by someone who stepped on an empty water bottle. It seemed that someone was watching them. The starosta said that she believed they would all do as she told them if they had at least a drop of conscience left. The teenagers fell silent for a while. And then Myung-jun Woo reached out and agreed, suggesting that we share and look for what we need faster. He smiled and came closer to Se-yeon, saying that they were a team now, so they had to stick together. But my classmate just turned around and asked who said she would join his team. Others were not in a hurry to distribute themselves. Ji-hoon An then turned around and suggested that we go straight ahead, and Ji-in Kim agreed and followed him. Shin Jae-kang asked Ye-jong Lee if she was going, and her classmate said she didn't want to, and asked if he really wanted to go. Sua-an and Charon Chong left together, and Yun-san Lee hugged Henson, asking if they would leave together. The teenager began to get nervous and sweat heavily, and then hesitantly agreed. Jae-in looked at this in silence, and then she asked Mr. Park if he could go on the search with Hansen. The man scratched his face and agreed. Yun-san Lee snorted and walked away from Henson, saying quietly that he was lucky this time. The teenager began to get even more nervous and sweat. Without turning around, Yun-san called out to Chang-shung, and then he came back and promised to pay her back. Jae-in called on Yura to unite and go together, and she agreed. After that, the starosta simply shone because she managed to organize everything. So the teenagers went in search. Everyone scattered in different paths through the bushes. Myung-jun Woo chased Se-yeon and yelled at her to wait for him. He was in a good mood because he was paired with his love, and asked what they would be looking for. Se-yeon did not look pleased, resenting the fact that Myung-jun was very loud. Then she ordered me to be quiet for a second and switched to a whisper. And then she joyfully shouted out what she had found. Myung-jun Woo silently watched what was happening. In front of him was a small lake with fish, and all of this was found by Se-yeon, who looked at Man-jun with satisfaction. Meanwhile, Mr. Park and Hansen walked forward into the bushes. The teacher walked behind and thought that the teenager was at least trying. Suddenly, Hansen's expression changed dramatically. After all, he found a real weapon on the ground. And she was not alone. There was a whole bunch of them. Hansen was shocked who would need that much, and who would leave it like that by the tree. The teenager went back and called Mr. Park to share his discovery, but then he abruptly stopped talking. Mr. Park was approached by Shin Jae-kang and wished him good morning. The teacher immediately changed his face, smiled sweetly and greeted him in a pleasant voice, asking if the teenager had found anything. Shin-jae smiled back and admitted honestly that he hadn't found anything important. Ye-jong-lee asked the teacher where Hansen was because they were supposed to be in a pair together. Mr. Park said the teenager was walking around the area on his own. Then he pointed to the bushes behind him. Shin Jae-kang looked at Mr. Park in silence. Then he smiled, scared. The teacher said that he felt a little sorry for him because he had tried so hard to help his friends. Meanwhile, Hansen grabbed a gun. Shin-jae smiled even more. And Mr. Park went on to say that they themselves knew how Hansen could sometimes get on their nerves with his behavior. Like the time he became paranoid and accused Shin-jae of bullying. The teenager smiled, saying that it was nothing and he was not offended. Ye-jong-lee looked at me sideways but did not speak. It seemed that she knew something. Mr. Park said that it was Hansen's own fault, because he should have stopped being afraid of everyone around him and opened up to his friends a little. Shin-jae agreed, saying that he had tried to make friends with him. Hansen himself heard all this. The teacher said he hoped that Hansen would somehow realize that he was an outcast for a reason. Shin-jae laughed at that and told Mr. Park not to talk like that. Hansen, meanwhile, had his fingers on the trigger. Then he took aim and shouted that it was not his fault. He repeated this constantly. He pointed his sights directly at Mr. Park's face. After that, there was a loud sound and the birds flew up sharply away from the forest. In the joint photo, only Don-soo was still painted over. Mr. Park made an ugly face when he said that it was Hansen's fault that he was insulted. This was the last straw, and the teenager pulled the trigger. Mr. Park heard the shot, but no one expected it. No one had time to react. The teacher's face was contorted again, but this time in pain. After that, he fell to the ground screaming, leaving a pool of blood under him. Shin Jae-kang was no less shocked than the others, with cold sweat pouring down his face. He looked up to see who had caused this. There on the floor was Hansen, screaming, swearing that he did not know the weapon was loaded, throwing it away from him. His face was contorted and looked like a crazy person, and he kept making excuses, repeating the same thing. Meanwhile, everyone gathered on the shore and asked Sinja what was taking so long. The rest of us watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Jae-in spoke first, asking what happened. Mr. Park was hanging around Sinja's neck, who carried him all the time. The teacher's leg was bleeding, leaving traces. Behind him was Ye-jong-lee and Hansen, who had no face at all. His eyes were glassy, like a maniac's, and cold sweat was streaming down his face, and the teenager kept repeating that it was not his fault. The company was approaching the others. No one was in a hurry to leave or ask questions. That is why Ye-jong-lee was the first to speak, saying that they would not believe what had happened. Jae-in was eager to hear the story. Ye-jong said with admiration that Hansen shot Mr. Park with a gun. Yun-san Lee asked where he found the weapon, not believing the story. Then Sinja threw all the weapons they found on the sand and said they found it on the other side of the island. At that time, everyone had questions, because no one could believe that there were weapons here at all. Mung Jun-woo looked down, realizing what was happening. Then Shin-jae confirmed his fears, saying that they were not all stuck on an ordinary island. Se-yeon came up to them. My classmates started shouting their admiration for the fact that they now had weapons. It was only Chae-in who dared to ask Mr. Park if he was okay in a trembling voice. The teacher sat down on the ground and said that fortunately it was just a scratch. Then everyone turned their attention to Hansen and asked him why he did it. The teenager did not know where to go because he was very worried about what had happened. Someone said they should tie up Hansen. Jae-in was outraged. Sinja repeated himself, ordering the teenager to be tied up. Hansen just listened to all this with a glassy stare, and Shin-jae said he was mentally unstable. He was crumpling his jacket, and Sinja added that this could happen again, and then someone else would be hurt. My classmates were silent. The news shocked them. They did not know what to say. Jae-in screamed that this was complete nonsense, and they couldn't have tied up their friend. Then an eerie smile appeared on Shin-jae's face, and then he turned his head and asked if Jae-in would take responsibility if Hansen shot his friend. Chae-in did not expect such a question and could not find the words to answer. Eun-jung Lee remained silent in condemnation. Then Sinja threw the ropes on the sand, saying they could tie Hansen up with them. Suddenly, Sharon Jong screamed, agreeing to tie up her classmate. Sua-an supported her, adding that Hansen was indeed too dangerous. Yun-san Lee also supported this idea. Myung-woo and Si-young were silent. Yura Choi, too. Suddenly, her eyes grew wide and she screamed. It turned out that she saw a boat on the water near their island. The rest of the classmates were also shocked. as it seemed they had a chance for salvation. Yunsan Lee shouted that it was indeed a boat. Then the teenagers ran to the water and shouted to be rescued, and shouted, waved, and did their best to show that they needed help, attracting attention. Yunsan Lee called out loud for help. Ji-hoon An also wanted to repeat after his classmate, but he suddenly fell silent in the middle of the sentence. He turned around and thought to himself that he had a good idea. Ji-hoon An saw the fire, and then he ordered everyone else to use fire. At that moment, someone came up and stepped on him. It was Meng Junwoo, and for some reason he started putting out the fire with his foot. It seemed that the teenager was making a titanic effort to do so, speeding up his movements. Suddenly, someone grabbed Meng Junwoo by the collar. It turned out that it was Ji-hoon An, who was shouting at his classmate, threatening to kill him. Meng Junwoo was not afraid at all, but ordered the teenager to come to his senses. And then he added that they were not in Korea. Ji-hoon An asked again. He didn't believe his classmate. Meng Junwoo began to speak. Meanwhile, Don-su's face was still painted over in the photo. Cries for help came from the island. Everyone was doing their own thing, but everyone was trying to attract attention. Sharon Jong was screaming that they were stuck, but something else caught her attention, and she looked away. And there she saw Jae-in trying to break up the teenagers. She stood between them and said that now was not the time to fight. Ji-hoon An called Menja a freak and offered to listen to where they were now. He gritted his teeth, and it was clear that the teenager could barely contain his aggression. At that moment, the rest of the classmates came up and pounced with questions. Then Manjun grabbed Ji-hoon An's hand, and he abruptly rejected her. After that, he confidently said that he believed they had gotten to North Korea. Everyone else asked in shock, because the mere thought of it caused great fear. Chae-in turned and asked if Mangjun was sure about it. The teenager looked back at the weapon, saying that their soldiers did not use such weapons. He went on to say that the only country still using such weapons in the vicinity was North Korea. Manjun is sure of this, because his father served in the army for a long time. Sharon Jung asked if Myungjun was joking, and they all wanted to believe it. Yunsan Lee also asked not to joke, saying that it was impossible. Se-yeon was silent. Menjun went on to say that they traveled through the northernmost part of Gangwon-do, a province of South Korea that borders North Korea, then got on a boat and ended up on an island. He said that he could not speak with 100% certainty, but everything pointed to it. Manjun reiterated that they were all in North Korea. Then he said that if they continued to call for help, they would be found. And then they will go to jail or even worse. Suddenly, Sharon Jong laughed out loud. Then she fell to the ground and began to cry loudly, saying that they were finished. She started to have a real hysteria. Yunsan Lee also began to panic and stammered to tell Mengjun that he was joking. And then he panicked and screamed loudly. Then they started falling on the sand and screaming and crying. After that, they decided to turn to Mr. Park. They asked him to come up with something because he was their teacher. Mr. Park did not understand what was happening at all and began to stutter. And then he muttered an apology under his breath and looked down. Sharon Jong panicked even more. The teenagers sat in silence, looking down. Someone was crying quietly. It was Yejong Lee, and she covered her eyes with her jacket. Suddenly, someone handed her water and offered her a drink. Yejong was distracted and asked what it was. Se-yeon replied that it was water from a stream she had recently found. She added that none of them had had anything to drink or eat today. Then, Yejong just took the water that Se-yeon offered and tipped it over. Then I yelled at her, asking how she could even think about it in such a situation. Se-yeon slapped her face and exhaled loudly. Then she asked with an irritated voice whether Yejong wanted to die of hunger or thirst. These words scared her classmate and she changed her tone. Then Se-yeon put down the water, saying that if she didn't want to die of thirst, she had to drink some water. She added that they all had to do what they could to get through the next day. Yejong turned away and fell silent. And then she took the water and drank it greedily, telling Se-yeon to stop pretending to be the smartest every time. Then the class gathered around the fire in a circle. Then Ji-hoon An came back and said that Se-yeon's words made sense. They had to try their best to survive on this island. Yejong turned to Ji-hoon, asking if he was serious. Ji-young Kim was dejectedly silent. Then they called Chae-in. Se-yeon handed her a briefcase with all the remaining food and asked her to divide it equally. Chae-in accepted the assignment and the portfolio. And I was shocked to think that this was all the food they had. They wouldn't last even 3 days. Meanwhile, someone had food in their pocket. When they appeared, the teenager immediately hid them with his hand. It was Yura Choi, and she was nervous, and her face showed it. Chae-in suggested that Se-yeon decide together what they need to do to survive. Suddenly, someone held out a rope. Se-yeon was even scared. Shinja looked at her. His gaze was eerie, and then said that they had business first. Then he extended the rope once more, ordering Hansen to contact him. The poor boy was silent and looked at the floor. He did not feel safe and could not stand up to everyone. Tears gathered in his eyes from the pain and humiliation he felt. Ji-in Kim was sleeping sweetly, and then she opened her eyes abruptly. I wish it was just a nightmare that stopped scaring me when the light came. Se-young sat and thought about it silently. Then the positive Menjun came up to her and greeted her, wishing her a good morning. Se-young still couldn't believe that they were all stuck on the island. Myungjun leaned over to his friend, saying that he had noticed that Jae-in hadn't slept for a long time. Se-young turned and looked at the headman. Jae-in was actually doing something and sorting through the portfolio. It seemed like she was facing a difficult task, and cold sweat even began to drip down her face. The other teenagers were talking to each other, all in a bad mood. They did not know what to do. The conversation was interrupted by Jae-in, who said that today they had to go out to look for food again. Se-young didn't understand why the headman had made such an abrupt decision. It seemed that something was wrong with her. Jae-in suggested that we have breakfast and split up again to search. Sharon-jong wondered how the headman could remain so cool and calm. Sua-an said that Chae-yin considered herself special only because she was the headman. Then she ordered everyone to get in line, and Jae-in would distribute food to them. It was not enough to fill you up. Sua-an was shocked when she was given such a small amount. She began to resent the fact that they hadn't eaten anything for a day. It wasn't enough. Jae-in replied that she was sorry, but it was all the food that was left, and the headman simply divided it equally. Sharon-jong told her not to joke and asked how she could live on that. Sua-an agreed, saying that Jae-in was just playing a joke on them. Then the starosta attacked them in response, reminding them that it was they who had eaten most of their supplies. After that, the girls had nothing to say and silence followed. Then Sharon-jong was outraged and called Jae-in a bitch. A sly smile appeared on one of the teenagers' faces. It was Shinjae, and he told Sharon-jong that everything was fine and they would eat what they were given. Of course, my classmate was outraged, saying that everyone was against her, and Shinjae's behavior was quite strange. Yunsan Lee quickly threw all the food into his mouth. He started chewing on it without another word. He looked at the weapons they had lying on the sand. After that, Yunsan said that there were not only rifles but a whole arsenal of different weapons. Suddenly, the teenager noticed a gun. Mi Young-woo ordered me not to touch it because it was probably a rocket launcher. Shinjae was interested in this information and perked up his ears. Yunsan Lee was angry with Menja, threatening to mentally remind him of it again. After that, he picked up a bigger weapon and began to examine it. Then he pointed it upwards and clicked the machine. A smile appeared on his face, and he asked his friend if he thought the weapon was even real. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion. Yunsan Lee cursed, saying that it was very scary. He did not expect the weapon to actually shoot. Sharon Young told Yongsan Lee that he was a big asshole. Ji-hoon An stared indifferently as the others called Yunsan an idiot. Then he asked Hansen what he was thinking when he shot. After that, he called the teenager crazy and that he was out of his mind. Hansen stammered and said he was innocent. He repeated this over and over again. Jae-in watched and regretted that it had happened. Meanwhile, her classmates were calling her names. Then the starosta ordered everyone to quickly split up. Yura Choi called out to Jae-in. She said that she had to go to the toilet and that she would be back soon. Jae-in smiled sweetly and told Yura Choi to take his time. Then my classmate just ran away like a bullet. She sat down on the sand and swore all the time, stuffing your cheeks with food. Meanwhile, Sua-an and Sharon Chong went into the woods to find something useful. Sharon Jong said they needed a break. Sua agreed, saying it was a good idea because she was too hungry to move. Then the friends sat down by a tree. Karen said that they had a beggar who would find everything for them, and her friend agreed. Another couple was walking along another path. It was Menjun and Se-young, and the teenager asked her to slow down, but Se-young did not answer. Suddenly, Menjun saw something in front of him and froze in shock. After all, there was a real huge cave in front of them. The teenagers went inside, and Se-young said that the cave was big enough for them all to take shelter in case of rain. Suddenly, something caught Se-yeon's attention. Mengjun noticed this and asked her what was wrong, but Se-young pretended that nothing had happened and turned away, although she had a lot of thoughts in her head that she didn't want to voice for some reason. Se-young wondered how the cave could be so clean, as if someone had lived there. Meanwhile, Sinja found something. He and Yejong Lee found Don-soo, who was covered with vests. She covered her face and mouth with her hands, but then she asked Sinja what it was in front of them. They thought it looked like Don-soo, Upon closer inspection, the teenagers did recognize their classmate. Yejong Lee could not stand it and vomited. Shinjae said that someone else had covered Donsa with life jackets, and then he added that it was already interesting, and his face became strange and creepy again.